And starting our second class in Buddhism in a Nutshell. And so this is the second one of 4. So this will go for tonight and the next 2 weeks. In the old days, we used to do 5 courses, but now it works out. We alternate this with a meditation class next month. So we alternate every 4 weeks. So in this class, last week, as you recall, I just gave a very gentle introduction to Buddhism as a whole, and sort of almost an introduction to the introduction, just sort of explaining typical attitudes and typical ways of thinking of that Buddhists do, because I think that's actually very important. Because in Buddhism, we actually have a whole different way of thinking. And that's actually part of, I think, if you want to talk about problems and solutions, that's, if you like, I think, a big part of the solution to obtain what we wish out of life. And in this, and then we also did a brief biography of Buddha Shakyamuni, who he was, a little bit about him, his life. And then we talked about the history of Buddhism, what happened after Buddha died and how it spread all over the place. And as I emphasized last time, the one thing that Buddha refused to do was to create, if you like, a pope of Buddhism. So the Buddha said, you know, I've taught you the Dharma, my teachings, and that's all you need. And I'm not going to appoint anybody to watch over the Sangha or the Buddhist community, or, you know, you don't need anybody to take care of you. In a certain sense, in Buddhism, there's a sense that we're all responsible for our own spiritual life. And as I mentioned, Buddha said just before he died, that you should be either a lamp or an island unto yourself, and use the Dharma as your teachings. So for that reason, Buddhism has spread pretty much all over the place, and it comes in many different colorings, if you like, because in each country that it spread to, it sort of took on the coloration of the country to which it spread. And for that reason, it can look sort of different. But actually, at its core, Buddhism is all the same. And the core of Buddhism is actually what I'm going to talk about tonight, which are called the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths, I think, is the heart and soul of Buddhism. It is the core teachings, and you can derive pretty much all the other teachings from the Four Noble Truths. And then after this, again, just sort of giving a prelude, the next stage and then after I finish the Four Noble Truths, for the next 2 classes, or maybe if I can get to part of it tonight, we're going to talk about the actual path to enlightenment. And as we talk about that actual path to enlightenment, we will lay out pretty much all the fundamental notions of Buddhism, things like renunciation, bodhicitta, the Mahayana path in particular, and so forth. And so we will lay all that out in great detail, or as much detail as I can do. Well, we've got 6 hours left to cover all of Buddhism, so I'll do the best I can. Hopefully it'll be clear. So at this point, let me just ask if there's any questions before I get started. You're not required to ask anything, but the nice thing about these classes is that they are pretty small, and it's a wonderful opportunity to ask questions. And so I encourage all of you to ask questions as they come up, because usually what happens is the question you're thinking about, other students are also thinking about the same question. And it's very helpful to discuss some of these things. And what I found in Buddhism is so connected. Every aspect of Buddhism is connected one to the other. And you can start talking on any Buddhist concept or teaching any specific Buddhist teaching. And if you keep following along, pretty much you find that you always end up teaching all of Buddhism. So that's one of the things I love about Buddhism, is that it's so completely internally consistent. So let's go ahead then and plunge into the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths are called true sufferings, true cause, true cessation, and true path. And so the emphasis is on suffering, which Buddha saw as the fundamental human problem. Although in Buddhism, suffering actually has a more general meaning. The actual Sanskrit word for suffering is dukkha, which means something closer to being unsatisfactory. So certainly actual suffering is very unsatisfactory, but there's other aspects of life that are also unsatisfactory. And so anyway, suffering has this more general notion of being unsatisfactory. And the analogy that Buddha always gave in when he was alive teaching, he often gave many analogies that are very famous and are very helpful for understanding. And one analogy that's often used for these Four Noble Truths is the analogy of sickness. So if you take the analogy of sickness, the idea of it is what Buddha said is suffering is essentially the illness or sickness of humanity. That's our fundamental problem. As I talked about in the last class, the one universal thing that's true of all sentient beings with a mind, which includes humans, is that we all wish to be happy and we don't want to suffer. And that is probably the bedrock condition of all of us. And so if you think about suffering as an illness, then what Buddha said is he said suffering or this dissatisfaction is not random. It's not just, it's just not just bad luck or whatever, but there's actually a reason. There's a cause why we suffer. And so the analogy with medicine is that, for many illnesses, there's a reason why you have a certain illness. There's maybe a virus that you have or some malfunction in your body. There's a reason why you have that illness. And just like in medicine, if you really understand what's causing that illness, then you have a good chance of actually curing yourself of that disease. And so that's the third noble truth, which is the true cessation. So the notion of true cessation is there is a cure for human suffering. And, and basically you can ask, well, how do I know that that's true? And the answer that Buddha always gave was because I'm cured. I'm an example. I'm an enlightened being. I have transcended suffering. And in the same way that I have transcended suffering, if you follow exactly the same path I do, which is removing the causes of suffering, then you too can also be cured of your suffering. And so the true cessation is this, and the medical analogy is saying that in this case, there really is a cure. It's like Buddha has the magic pill, if you like. And that magic pill is the fourth noble truth, which is called true path. And the true path is, if you like, the method for accomplishing the cessation of suffering. So that's, in the medical analogy, that's like taking the pill. And if there is a pill that cures an illness and you do take it, then you will be cured. You're absolutely guaranteed if you have the right pill. And in the same way, what the Buddha said is that if you follow the correct path, you can absolutely achieve freedom from suffering. And again, just to introduce some terminology, because terminology is really important, because many people come to Buddhist teachings and they get overwhelmed by the terminology. And so I'm going to, as much as possible, in very simple terms, try to also introduce a lot of this terminology for you. And so in the standard terminology, what we would say is that this world of suffering, the world that we're used to, the world that we live in, is called samsara. And when you achieve freedom from suffering, you transition out of samsara into a condition that's known as nirvana, or sometimes a synonym of nirvana is bliss, because it's an extremely blissful state. So anyway, I'm going to come back and talk more about this as we go along. But anyway, so this is the beginning part of this introduction of the terminology. And I'm going to come back and explain these terms more in detail as we go deeper into it. So let's start, though, with true suffering, because it's very important. If suffering is our real problem, and if you remember last week in the biography that I gave in the biography, that was the thing that Buddha, in his biography, we talked about the three messengers, which were sickness, aging, and death. When Buddha saw that, that's when he got this notion. There is suffering, and this suffering seems to be built into our lives. There seems to be no way of avoiding suffering. And in Buddha's biography, what he said is, he said, this is unacceptable. I'm not willing. There has to be some solution to this problem of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And he was determined to find the solution. And that's why he set out on his spiritual journey, which lasted, as I said, 6 years, from the age of 29 to the age of 35. As when the Buddha gave teachings, we actually learned that this journey was actually far longer, because there is this notion of rebirth. And the Buddha said he could remember all of his previous rebirths. And he actually told stories about his previous rebirths. And so we could see that actually the Buddha was on a spiritual journey for thousands, millions, who knows how many lifetimes, before finally becoming a Buddha. So it wasn't just this little snap thing. In 6 years, he suddenly became a Buddha. He had been preparing this for many lifetimes before that. But nonetheless, this whole notion of is so critical, is suffering. So what is suffering? And Buddha actually laid out 3 different important types of suffering. Because there are different types of suffering. And they're all troublesome, and they're all dissatisfactory. But the 3 that he listed are usually given the name of manifest suffering, sometimes called the suffering of suffering. And I'm just going to list all 3 together, because it's helpful to see all 3, and then I'm going to come back and talk about each one individually. The second was the suffering of change. The third is called pervasive suffering. And sometimes people use other terminologies as well, but this is a common terminology that at least I'm familiar with. So manifest suffering, or the suffering of suffering, is exactly what you think of it as. That's our normal suffering. So if you get cancer and you're in great pain, that's manifest suffering. It can also be mental anguish. Sometimes people develop huge anxieties and they have huge suffering in their mind. And as we will talk more deeply about, a lot of Buddhism actually says a lot of our suffering is actually in our mind, far more than the physical component. Actually, the worst part of suffering is the part that comes from our mind. And again, we're going to talk more deeply about that as we go along, but that's just something to keep in mind. So that first part is what when we talk about suffering, that's the obvious thing that comes to everybody's mind. Now, the second part is actually the most interesting thing of all, because I think this is something that most people don't think about. And certainly I never thought about it before I met Buddhism, the suffering of change. So you can say, what does that mean? What is suffering of change? Why is change a problem? And the answer is, it is surprising, but just the fact that the world changes is unsatisfactory. Perhaps in this case, unsatisfactory or dissatisfactory is better to speak about than manifest suffering when you talk about the suffering of change. So what is an example of that? Why should change cause a problem? Well, to start off with, I think one thing that's very familiar in our culture and society is people don't like change. People get really anxious if they have to change their job, or if you have to move from one house to another. It often creates huge anxiety. People are often very anxious about the future. And why are they anxious about the future? Because they know the future will be different than what's happening now. And there will be change. And maybe that change will be a change for the worse. So change, in just an ordinary sense, causes often huge anxiety. People are always worried that the other shoe is going to drop and we're going to get clobbered, that something terrible is going to happen. Maybe there will be like COVID did. What a shock that was and how terrible that has been, and still is. You can look at the stock market. There were extremely wealthy people in 1929 when we had the big stock market crash. And people were so unhappy about losing all their money that New York City, they were throwing themselves out of windows. That's before we had the giant skyscrapers. So in those days, you could open windows and throw yourself out. You just had tall buildings. But more generally, again, just to probe a little bit more deeply into this, and I think this is an important thing. That this is a place where, as you're studying Buddhism, it's important for you to think about some of these concepts. Because until you really think about it for yourself, you don't really quite get it, or it doesn't make an impact. But the way, part of the idea of the suffering of change is it means that even the very best things, even the things that bring us the greatest pleasures in life, because things change, are also our greatest sources of suffering. Imagine yourself as the millionaire in 1929. That's when money was more valuable. They didn't have billionaires, they had millionaires. So imagine yourself a millionaire in 1929. Your life is wonderful. You have lots of wealth, lots of money, you have big houses, everything you could want. And then suddenly the stock market crashes and you lose all of your money. For that person, there's nothing more terrible than to be in a wonderful place and have it all taken away from you. That is far worse than almost if you had never had it. So there's a huge suffering associated with that change. And that is what the suffering of change is. It's like everything good will be the same. The one constant in our world is that the world always changes. And so what the Buddha said is that even if you have wonderful, good circumstances, you can't hang on to it. It will always change. Maybe you can hang on to perhaps your wealth for this life, but then you die. And then you're reborn. And if you're reborn, you may not have any wealth. You may be born into a terrible existence. We'll come back and talk about rebirth, because that's another whole thing that we have to introduce. But for the moment, people get sick. Just because you can be a billionaire and still get cancer. So you can have the most wonderful life and suddenly you get a terrible cancer, like terrible disease like cancer or leukemia or COVID. People, probably lots of rich people have died who have had COVID. So even, and that's the problem with life. The problem with life is that it's uncertain. Because everything changes, it is uncertain. You never have a guarantee. So that no matter how wonderful the moment is, everybody is always a little bit edgy and a little bit nervous because you just don't know. I mean, maybe you'll be lucky, maybe things will continue on to be great, but maybe they won't. Maybe you'll get COVID, maybe you'll get some other crazy disease or whatever. I was just watching PBS about this Amy Tan, this wonderful writer, and her life was sailing along wonderful. And then all of a sudden she started being confused in her mind, all sorts of craziness was going on. And eventually she figured out that she had been bitten by a tick and had gotten Lyme disease. And they gave her medicine and she got better, but there was still leftover stuff even after she was all cured from the Lyme disease. So, it's like, that's the way life is. So this notion of the suffering of change is a huge part of Buddhism. And in fact, the notion that everything changes, if there's one fundamental notion or idea of Buddhism, it's that everything changes, nothing is permanent. And that pervades almost everything, and that has amazing consequences for how we look at the world. And that's part of the reason too. Another big motif in Buddhism is not clinging or grasping to things. And part of the reason why you don't want to cling and grasp to things, you don't want to hang on to it really tightly, is because it's going to change. No matter what wonderful thing you have, you're not going to continue to have that forever. Something's going to change. You know, it's like we're young. You know, we may be young, we may be beautiful, healthy, the world is our oyster, but then we grow old. Or, you know, I mean, the sad thing too is even, and the Buddha even explicitly talked about this, you know, having children for many people is the greatest bliss of life. You know, it's a thing that we are most emotionally attached to. But, you know, children die every day. You cannot, you know, the thing, my mother died last year. She was almost 100. She was 99. But even up to the end of her life, she's still worried about, we had 5 kids in our family. She's still worried about all of us. You know, a mother never stops worrying about their kids. And, you know, because you never know, things can happen. People can get sick, they can, you know, people go on drugs, anything can happen. So, you know, you buy a new car, it gets old. You know, it's hilarious. Sometimes you see people that buy a new car, and they're washing it every other day, and then they go to Trader Joe's and they park it 3 blocks away so it doesn't get scraped. But then, you know, after a few years, they just don't care. You know, it gets banged around. So, so at any rate, this notion of change is important. Now, the third one actually is the deepest, and that's the hardest to explain. And that's this notion of pervasive suffering. And in a sense, this notion of pervasive suffering is, in a sense, what underlies all the other forms of suffering. The suffering of suffering, or actual suffering, or the suffering of change that we just were talking about. This pervasive suffering says is that it's the nature of the world to be suffering. And when I say suffering, I generalize it to being unsatisfactory or dissatisfactory. And so, as I've said, in Buddhism, everything that happens in Buddhism happens because there is a cause. And hang on, I just want to do, sorry. There's a way of, okay, I can't see it now. There's a way, I think, of spotlighting myself for the video, but I don't see it right now. Okay, so I won't worry about it. So at any rate, the key idea is to, okay, so this notion of pervasive suffering is that actually there's a reason why samsara, the world that we live in, always has this suffering. And the reason why samsara always has this suffering is because, in a certain sense, the reason why we are reborn into samsara is because we cause ourselves to be reborn into samsara. And again, this is a little bit deep, and this is going to be a little bit difficult to understand, but it's actually our grasping or clinging to this life is what actually, in the long run, causes us to be reborn in samsara. At a deeper level, it's our ignorance, and which, as I've talked about before, ignorance is the root affliction or delusion, the root of all of our negativity, which is the sense of a permanent self in the simplest level. But at any rate, it is our delusions or afflictions, and particularly this root delusion or affliction, which is the notion of ignorance, which causes us to be reborn. And in effect, what you do to achieve liberation from samsara is to remove this root ignorance. And that's how you achieve ultimately nirvana. And there's a pathway to doing this, which we will talk about in great detail. So at any rate, there is this notion that the fact that life is dissatisfactory is not random. There's a real reason for it. And there's a real reason why we experience this. Now, the funny thing about this is I was thinking about this past week, as I was thinking about talking about the Four Noble Truths. In a certain sense, the real thing that's sort of surprising about us, especially in the West, and maybe even particularly in the United States, we always have this notion of progress. We're always looking for a heaven on earth. And if you take this notion of what Buddha said, is that samsara is never going to be perfect. And the reason it's never going to be perfect is because there was negativity that caused it. And so there can't be a complete positivity that comes out of a negative cause. So we're never going to have a nirvana within samsara or on earth itself. And so in a certain sense, I don't know. I mean, I think it's imbued in my psyche, but I'm always looking for this. I'm always hoping the next president will make new laws, things will get better and better, and finally things will be perfect. And I was thinking, this is really radical to say it will never be perfect. We'll never get the right president, the right people, it's never going to all work out on earth. And of course, that's our experience. I mean, when in our history, human history, have things ever been perfect? When has there never been war or disease, all sorts of terrible things? And of course, what the Buddha said is he said that if you look on the scale of an individual life, there's always going to be sickness. Very few people escape life without sickness. Actually, my mother was one of them. She was very rarely sick in her 99 years. So you can get close, but in the end, she had a stroke and died. So, so there's always sickness, and there's always aging. Even if we manage to avoid sickness and live a long life, we're all going to get old. And as we age, we certainly feel these. It's very uncomfortable to get old. All sorts of things happen that it'd be nice to be healthy and young. And finally, we're all going to die. Although for Buddhists, dying is not actually difficult. And that's actually one of the benefits of being a Buddhist, is you can learn to actually have even a joyful death. You can learn to be completely calm and have no anxiety when you die. And in fact, there's even courses that are taught that way. A number of years ago, Geshe Sherab at our center taught a whole course on exactly how you achieve this. But I would say in general, you don't even need a special course, that if you just follow the Buddhist path, your mind will gradually get calmer, freer of anxiety, and death will actually not be that difficult, I think. Okay, so that's the first noble. Yeah, the other thing too is, again, for some of these terminology, another word that they use that you sometimes run across is they say that our current life is contaminated, or samsara is contaminated, and which sounds very nasty. But actually, it's not that bad. What it really means is it's contaminated with these delusions, these afflictions of essentially the three root afflictions are ignorance, attachment or greed, and the third one is hatred or pushing away. And those are the things which cause most of our suffering, actually, either directly or indirectly through karma, which again, we will also have to eventually talk about karma. But we're getting there. Okay. And it is interesting because I said that life is unsatisfactory. There is one thing in life where you can have a feeling of being satisfactory. And that's when you get involved in spiritual life. And in particular, in some of the very deep spiritual meditations, they can be completely blissful and feel very satisfactory. And in fact, the Buddha used to recommend developing these deep meditations because they're the closest we can get to nirvana on earth, are some of these very deep blissful meditations. And in fact, and these deep blissful meditations also often carry over into our ordinary life. And we find that even in our ordinary life, we have much less anxiety, things don't bother us as much, and our life is just much more peaceful. And that's another thing too, another theme that comes up in Buddhism, is that happiness in Buddhism is associated with a peaceful life. The Buddha said, if your mind is disturbed or agitated, that really means usually that one of these delusions or afflictions. I keep using these two terms. They refer to the same phenomena. In Sanskrit, it's called klesha, but they're often translated two ways. And both of them are accurate because these delusions are actually afflictions. They make our mind disturbed, they make us unhappy, and they're also delusions because they distort the way that we look at the world. Okay, okay. And the other famous sufferings that Buddha talked about is, besides sickness, aging, and death, there are two others which are quite interesting to think about, because they are sort of pervade our whole life and are sort of very general. But that's this notion of not getting what we want and having to encounter what we don't want. So that's sort of a more general thing, you know, it's sort of like, you know, we all want big houses, we want new cars, we always have these things, or we want a new job, or maybe we want our children to do well, or maybe we're sick and we want to be, there's always things in life that we want. And one of the really common sufferings is that most of the time we don't get it. I mean, occasionally we do get it and it's wonderful, but that's a common suffering, is the suffering of not getting what we want. And the other suffering is that we always have these things that we encounter that we don't like. You know, maybe we have to go to the dentist. Or maybe, you know, or maybe we have to get some medical tests, which is unpleasant. You know, there's always some unpleasantness in life that we'd rather not deal with. Or maybe there's somebody at work who's always annoying us or something. There's always unpleasant aspects of work. And that's another common suffering. So these other two sufferings are very general. And it's actually worth thinking about because it's, again, something I think that's helpful. Okay, so that's the first. So that's the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. And I spent a long time on it because I think, you know, because none of the other three noble truths make much sense until you realize how much suffering is a problem in our lives. And in fact, the reason why most people come to any religion is because they're afraid of suffering. They're afraid that something will go wrong in their life, that they'll get sick, or maybe something will happen to their kids, or maybe they'll lose their money. And in fact, often religions become enormously wealthy out of this sort of fears and anxieties. You know, the Catholic Church in the medieval ages was enormously wealthy because all these people were afraid of dying and going to hell. So they would give all this money, being told that if they give all this money, it would absolve them of all the terrible things they did, and they would go straight to heaven. And even in Tibet, many people gave a lot of money. The Tibetan monasteries became extremely wealthy in ancient Tibet because people felt like, oh, if I'm very generous to these monasteries and give a lot of money, good things will happen to me and to my family. And in a karmic sense, I mean, part of that is true. You know, actually being generous is a positive thing, creates good karma. So there is some general truth to it, but most of it, I think, was driven by fear. And so in Tibet, also a lot of wealth went into these monasteries. And sadly, like everywhere, it caused a lot of corruption. So even in Tibet, there was a lot of corruption. You know, if there's a lot of wealth concentrated in one place, people are always going to try to grab their hands on it. And the wealthy families in Tibet were always trying to grab their money off of that wealth in the monastery, and it actually created a lot of corruption. In the same way that happened in the medieval ages in the Catholic Church, there was huge corruption also. So wealth is accumulating huge amounts of wealth is not a good thing, even if both of these cases it was done by people who were good religious people and who were being very generous and kind-hearted and wanted good things to happen. Okay, so now let's go on to the cause of suffering. So in a certain sense, I sort of think that this is is almost as important as the first point, the cause of suffering. So, you know, as I was saying in Buddhism, everything is cause and effect. Things don't happen randomly. So if there is suffering or dissatisfaction in the world, there's a reason for it. And in fact, in this case, it's critically important because if you're going to get rid of the suffering and dissatisfaction, clearly the solution has to be getting rid of the cause. So if there's a cause that causes the suffering, if you eliminate the cause, then the suffering has to go away. There's no choice. So, and in fact, in a sense, that gives you the notion of why the third noble truth is possible, why it's possible to get a cessation of suffering, because if you can identify the cause and if you can eliminate it, of course, you can cause a cessation. And then the fourth noble truth, the path or the method, will be actually examining that cause and figuring out the correct method to eliminate it. And that's basically the way that Buddhism works, in a simple way. So in Buddhism, there are sort of two causes of our suffering, although in a certain sense, there's just one. So it depends on how deeply you analyze it. So at a higher level, they talk about two causes of suffering. One cause of suffering is karma. And the other cause of suffering are this klesha, these delusions, afflictions. And they're not unrelated because it's actually these delusions, afflictions, this klesha, which is what causes us to do all of the negative karma that causes all of our suffering. So at its root, if we could get rid of these afflictions, delusions, then in a sense, we can get rid of all of our negative karma, so we can get rid of all of our suffering. And among these, as I said, among these delusions and afflictions, of which there are many, many different kinds. There's things like, jealousy, hatred, almost all the negative things that you can think about are usually a delusion or an affliction. But it's said that there's sort of three root delusions or afflictions. The very deepest root is ignorance, from which everything else spreads. But then if you divide it a little bit more carefully, the three root delusions, as I said before, is ignorance, attachment or greed, wanting things, clinging to things, grasping onto things. And in that grasping and clinging, creating all sorts of negativity, which is basically harming other people to accomplish gaining all these things that we think are going to make us happy. And so that's sort of pulling good stuff toward us. The opposite is pushing the bad stuff away from us. So that's hatred and things associated with that, anger, hatred, people we don't like, pushing away things that look ugly or distasteful. And it's also a type of, in a way, it's a type of clinging or grasping, but it's sort of an opposite clinging or grasping, it's a pushing away. But in a certain sense, when we're pushing away, we're so caught up that we're just as much caught up in this pushing away as the opposite type of where we're bringing stuff toward us. In either case, we're completely bound up in these emotions and sort of stuck. It's like when you get angry and, when people go nuts with anger or hatred, they are crazy. And it's like their mind is just completely taken over. And in Buddhism, we often talk about control of the mind, or control or lack of control. And sometimes in Buddhism, it sounds like we have no free will. They say that our minds are, we don't have control. And what that really means is it means that when these delusions or afflictions really strongly take hold, it's like they just take over us. And I think that the most common example is this notion of when people blow up with anger, it's like sometimes that they do things that even harm themselves, things that are totally irrational, but they can't stop themselves. Once this anger arises, it's almost like a wildfire, it just flames out of control. And so that's when we're out of control. We're out of control when we're under control of delusions. And the way to get back in control is to get control over our delusions, to let go of this grasping or clinging that is controlling us, to have this sort of more neutral attitude. Being able to let go, if you like, is the opposite of clinging. And so that's how we gain control, and that's how we ultimately will learn to make ourselves happy. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about rebirth and karma here, because again, the other notion that is central to Buddhism is this notion of karma, and also the notion of rebirth. So let me talk just a little bit about rebirth. So, one can spend months talking about this rebirth and so forth, and samsara. Like, what is samsara? And when I talk about what is samsara, it turns out that in Buddhism, there are actually different realms that you can be born into. And in fact, the Buddha talked about 6 different realms. And so these 6 different realms are hell realms, hungry ghost realms, animal realms, those are the 3 negatives, the human realm, and 2 levels of godlike realm, so great realms. The problem with all of these different realms in samsara is, like everything else in samsara, is nothing permanent. So unlike in Christianity, if you die and end up in hell, in Christianity, you're there for eternity. But in Buddha, you're there until you burn up all your negative karma. And then when you burn up all your negative karma, you rise up to a higher realm. And so, again, when we talk about these other realms, the only other realm that we can directly see is the animal realm. And so the animal realm, so it is considered that we can be reborn as animals. In fact, the Buddha talked about even he remembered in his previous birth. He talks about having been reborn as an animal and even told stories about it. These are the famous Jataka tales where he talked about his previous rebirths, and these were collected in a book, many of them written down. And in Buddhism, it's actually taught that we can be reborn as an insect as well. And I think that's the hardest thing for Buddhists or people coming into Buddhism. But as I said before, to be a Buddhist, you don't have to believe anything. You don't have to believe in rebirth. You don't have to believe in all of these things. So I think that what you should do is, if you find these notions upsetting, is just don't worry about them, because they're really not that important. What's really important is our present life and what's happening in our present life, and whether our present life is getting better or worse, and how we can use these 2 tools of Buddhism to make our present life better moment by moment. But nonetheless, in the bigger scope of things, there are these various realms. And essentially, in Buddhism, again, the terminology is important. And the terminology that's used is sentient being. And in this notion of sentient being is this notion of, in this notion of sentient being is this notion that, so now we're on to the thing. We had a question. Hang on, let me answer that question, which is an example of burning negative karma. Well, the sort of thing that there are actually hells on earth, and that's all they talk about, resembling hells. So there are conditions on earth, for certain people on earth, there's a wide range of conditions. So there's some people who are living, and it's like they're living heaven on earth. They've got lots of money, they never get sick, their life is wonderful, and that's caused by positive karma. And so that sort of resembles a heavenly realm. And at the same time, there are people in Africa that get raped, mutilated, all sorts of horrible diseases, their whole family dies. It's almost like a hell on earth, or even maybe gang life in some of the cities in America. And so you can sort of see resembling hells. And essentially what causes you to go, again, as I talked about last week, morality in Buddhism is all about harming and non-harming, or being beneficial. So the way that karma works is that if you harm other people, it will come back on you with some form of suffering. And if you are beneficial and help people, it will return to you in terms of positive things happening. For example, and what you do is related to the type of karma that comes back. So for example, an example of this for positive karma is that if you're generous, give money to help poor people, to give money to religious organizations, money that maybe helps feed the poor or whatever, those are generous things that help people. And that's the cause of wealth in future lives. So it said, if you want to be really wealthy in a future life, be very generous with helping people with your money. Be generous with your money. Things that cause hellish realms are things that when you cause great harm to people. So if you torture people, if you kill people, if you and you can do this mentally as well as physically. Some people can be just totally destroy a person mentally with the way they talk to them and so forth. So that's how you create hellish realms, is by doing great harming, essentially. And of course, for all of this, actually, you never have just one piece of karma ripen at a time. In all of our lives, we're constantly generating karma. Most of our karma is neutral because we're neither harming nor benefiting people. So that karma is sort of neutral, and so we get neutral results from that. But it's also, the Buddha said, and this is really important, it's not one-to-one. So it's not as if I kill you, so then in some future life, somebody's going to come and kill me. But it's more like you create this great harm, and so you create a situation for great harm to come back to you. But actually, how that karma manifests actually depends on who you are at the moment. If you're a very spiritual person in this moment, and some of that very bad karma ripens for you, it's often lessened or ameliorated. It doesn't come back. So, maybe you did something harmful to somebody else, but maybe it will come back if you're a wonderful person and you are very positive. Your current situation affects how that karma ripens, and maybe it will come back as a headache instead of something more terrible. And in fact, sometimes when Buddhists get sick or have some terrible illness, they're actually quite happy because they're saying, oh, this illness may be a much ameliorated form of negative karma. Maybe I'm burning up this negative karma in some way that actually isn't so bad, because a little bit of physical suffering isn't bad compared to what it could be. And you can think about it, think about all the terrible ways you could suffer on earth. Sometimes an illness may not be that bad. And I've even known certain Buddhist monks who have even prayed to get a serious disease like cancer or something for precisely that reason, because they want to burn up their negative karma. And it's said that as long as you patient, when something terrible is happening to you, and there's nothing that you can do about it, so in Buddhism we always say, if you get a headache or something, you can take an aspirin, take the aspirin. If you get sick, go to the doctor and get cured. So of course, take care of yourself. But at the same time, there are times in life where just bad things happen and it's out of our control. It's sort of on a scale beyond us. When that happens, like a serious illness, maybe you'll get cancer or something. For me, this actually happened in 2007, I got gallstone pancreatitis, which is one of the most painful illnesses you can get, and spent 2 weeks in the hospital, came close to even dying. But I did what I was taught to do, which is patient acceptance. If you patiently accept the negative suffering that you're going through, that burns up that negative karma. And for me, I'm very convinced that the illness I had was actually a wonderful thing, that it probably burned up some really horrendous karma that could have been far worse and was actually a positive thing. There was another thing I've done too, which I will talk about when we get to the Mahayana path. There are things called taking and giving and other techniques where you can learn to transform your suffering and bring it onto the spiritual path. And that can be extremely powerful. And to me, it was extremely helpful. And so I look back, so I spent these 2 weeks in the hospital, was under such severe pain that these morphine-like drugs that were 80 times more powerful than morphine couldn't even touch the pain. So it was very painful, but it was okay. I mean, I look back at that time and it doesn't feel that bad to me. And it was because of spiritual practice. So it is important that Buddhism can be very practical. So it can actually, there are specific ways of thinking and practicing that can be very beneficial when you're under extreme situations. And again, it involves this notion of bringing the spiritual path, the negative parts of your life onto the spiritual life. And in fact, it's said that, most of our life is our ordinary life. And if the only spiritual practice is when you're meditating or doing some specific spiritual practice, you're wasting most of your life. So you actually want to use your whole life and bring it onto the spiritual path. But we'll talk more about that as we go along. And it is possible. And the other thing to say too is that in Buddhism, everything is continuous. Buddha, in one of the Buddhist sutras, the Buddha gave this beautiful analogy that he talked about. Buddhism was like, think of yourself being on this beautiful sandy beach, and think of walking into the ocean. As you walk into the ocean and the beach gently slopes down, you gradually get deeper and deeper into the ocean, and you find yourself, first the water covers your toes and then your ankles, and you slowly get deeper until you fully immerse yourself. And the Buddha said that that's the way that you practice Buddhism, that you start off slow and gradual, and you gradually go deeper and deeper into it. And so that's a very beautiful example. And in fact, another example that's often said, that was often used, is that practicing Buddhism should be like a gently flowing river. You should continuously move along, and it shouldn't be like a waterfall. And what happens, sometimes people start practicing Buddhism, and they go nuts, and they start practicing day and night, and then they burn out, and then they stop practicing. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. So you always want to take care of yourself and practice gradually, practice within your capacity. So in Buddhism, we always start with where we are. We start with practicing simple things that we can do today. And if you start practicing those simple things that you can do today, then gradually you will build up a capacity to do more difficult things. And there's actually a good reason for that, because again, I was saying that nothing in Buddhism is random. Essentially, as you're doing those simple things, you're generating positive karma. You're creating the karma to be on the spiritual path. And then the spiritual path gets easier because you've created that positive karma. And as that positive karma ripens, it makes it easier to go deeper into the spiritual path. And in fact, for many Buddhists, that's the whole point of karma, actually. For most ordinary people, you talk about karma, and all they think about is negative karma, stopping all the terrible things that could happen to you for happening. But for the deep spiritual practitioners, the bad thing about negative karma is that it blocks your spiritual progress. It blocks your spiritual path. And the main reason for a really deep practitioner to get rid of your negative karma is to remove these hindrances to your spiritual path so that you can accelerate your progress on the spiritual path. And I think I mentioned last time, there was a nun that I once knew who was going to many Buddhist events, flying all over the place, and she kept getting upgraded for no good reason. And it really upset her because she thought she was wasting all of her good karma getting upgrades when it should be, she wanted it to go to her spiritual practice. So I think that's a very helpful way to think about it. You shouldn't just think about terrible things or good things happening to you, because again, the more, you don't have to worry. If you are practicing on the spiritual path, good things are going to eventually come to you. You don't have to worry about it. But I would say the most important thing that you really want to have happen to you is you want moment to moment to feel better about your life. You want to feel happy moment by moment. And so we're talking about these bigger pictures, nirvana, samsara. We will essentially talk about nirvana as being liberated from samsara or achieving a form of enlightenment. So these are big goals. And it's so common for spiritual people to get so hung up about these big goals. You know, it's like, sometimes people will say, oh, I'm going to become enlightened next year. Or why can't I do it next month? You know, it's like people get hung up. It's almost as if spiritual life is worthless unless you become enlightened in the next moment. And that's the wrong way to think about it. You know, the right way to think about it is don't worry about the future. In fact, the Buddha always talked about that. In Buddhism, the emphasis is always on the present moment, because it's only in the present moment that we can change our lives. And so if you keep making your life better moment by moment, the future will take care of itself. You don't have to worry about it. So the critical thing is really focusing on the present. And in focusing on the present, we're going to be coming to this in a second. It's these afflictions and delusions that are the critical thing. These are the things that make us unhappy moment by moment. And in Buddhism, we talk about another big term is antidote. And what an antidote means is it means a method for ameliorating these or removing these delusions and afflictions. And usually an antidote is a temporary fix. So it's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound or taking an aspirin if you get a headache. So it's a temporary fix, but nonetheless, it's an important step because over time, you can slowly dampen down the worst of your delusions and afflictions. You can gradually get rid of even some. And ultimately, through very deep meditations, there's a path where you can remove them permanently. And in fact, what enlightenment actually consists of, in a certain sense, is eradicating each of these delusions and affliction, pulling them out by the root, removing them permanently, one by one. And these are said to be, again, we talked about the contaminants. These are said to be contaminating our life. This is what makes our life bad. These are the bad things. And as you get rid of these one by one, eventually you are gradually purifying yourself. And when you're a completely pure being, meaning you've removed all of these delusions and afflictions, that in a sense is what enlightenment is. And again, this permanent removal or that you come to, we're going to talk about that. That comes from very deep meditations. And that involves these notions of selflessness and emptiness, which is what you meditate on. And again, this comes back to this notion of the root cause is ignorance. And ignorance is tied up in the selflessness and notion of emptiness. So that's why, so that's how you can remove things from the root. But again, we have to explain that a lot more carefully. But it's good to get a sense of these things even early on as we are here. So let me stop. Are there any questions? I keep throwing all this. I should be asking for more questions. Okay. No questions? Okay. So I will keep going then. Okay. So again, I talked about these different realms of rebirth. The only thing I want to say at this point is that you can be reborn in different realms. But again, at this point, this is not the place to really worry about that. I mean, again, worry about making your life moment by moment. And if you do that, rebirth will take care of itself. And again, rebirth is not the typical way that it's thought of in the West. It's not as though you were once Cleopatra Now you've been reborn here. What happens in rebirth? Is there a prayer for? Yeah, there's actually there's a question about whether there's a prayer for purification, and in a sense, yeah, there are specific spiritual practices. The two in our tradition are 35 confession Buddhas and Vajrasattva mantra recitation. These are ways that are taught so that you can. There are actually ways that you can purify, and there's actually more understanding behind that. It's just not a ceremony. One is actually, as one is doing this ceremony, one is in a sense transforming your mind. So if I have time, I will talk about that, but it's too much to talk about it here. I'm just giving the big picture. But I will come. Yeah, there's a question. Mary Jo, do you have a question? You're raising your hand. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
you. It seems as though the human realm is befraught with so many negativities, and we can never hope to have a perfect human life. But yet I've also heard, maybe from a different tradition, but from Buddhism, about how very, very fortunate we are to have a human birth. And so it seems like it's kind of a two-way thing. We're so fortunate, and yet it could never be entirely satisfactory.
Yes, that's exactly true. That's very perceptive. That's exactly correct. But I'm going to talk about that actually, maybe in the next class. I think probably in the next class.
Okay.
But it is taught in our tradition that human rebirth is very precious. And in fact, human rebirth is considered a high rebirth. So there's 3 lower realms, but the human birth is the sort of the lowest of the 3 high rebirths. The other 2 are very godlike realms. But actually, the human realm is considered better than even the godlike realms. And again, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is, again, this notion of change, that everything is constantly changing. If you could move to a godlike realm and stay there forever, then there would be no problem. Then that would be great, So it'd be like the Christian version. In the Christian version, if you go to hell and if you go to heaven and you're in heaven forever, for eternity, then you're eternally happy and the problem's solved. The problem in Buddhism is that these heavenly realms are still in samsara, so they're still subject to change. The reason that took you into a heavenly realm was positive karma. And when you're having those great enjoyments that you have in these heavenly realms, what you are doing is actually wonderful good karma is ripening. So you're burning up all of your really good karma, and eventually you run out of all the good karma you generated, and then you're going to have to fall back down into the lower realms. So the terrible thing about the heavenly realms is that it's not permanent, and you're going to drop back down again. And so in a sense, it's almost like frightening. It's like, what good is it to be in this great godlike realm if you're going to lose it all again? And so when you start thinking about it like that, then you realize that the most important thing is getting out of the samsara, being liberated from samsara, achieving the state of nirvana, because it's in nirvana, it's called eternal peace and happiness bliss. So when you're outside of nirvana, when you're outside of samsara and have moved to nirvana, then you're home free. Then you have eternal bliss, and you're never going to fall back down. At that point, that's the equivalent of the Christian heaven, if you like, where you have eternal happiness. So the reason why a human rebirth is considered so important is because it's the perfect place for spiritual practice. Because if you're going to do spiritual practice, you need enough good things to be able to practice. You need a good mind, you need relatively good circumstances. It's like if you're born in in Africa and deep poverty and disease-filled stuff like that, it's very hard to do spiritual practice because you don't have good conditions. But for people like us who can go to Buddhist centers, we have enough time to practice, we have, relatively good circumstances, that's an amazing thing. And so we have the chance to actually do spiritual practice and become liberated from samsara. The problem with the heavenly realms is it's too wonderful. Because if you think about it, when life is really flowing, really wonderful, you've got lots of money, everything, good health, everything good is happening to you, people don't feel like doing any spiritual practice. They're not motivated. It's like, why do people come to religion? Well, they almost always come to religion when disasters strike. So what Buddhism says is, it says you need enough suffering to motivate you, but not so much that you debilitate yourself. And you don't want too much bliss because that's debilitating on the other side, because then you're not motivated. So the human rebirth is the most perfect place to be, because you have enough suffering to motivate you, but you're not so blissed out but again, you have the circumstances you need to spiritually practice. So that is, so precious spiritual human rebirth is considered absolutely wonderful. Okay. Thank you for asking that. That was a very good question. Okay, so again, just very briefly, getting back to rebirth. So in rebirth, what's really moves on to your next life is mainly your karma. So in this life, you were born at certain circumstances. You had certain parents, you had wealth or lack of wealth, and you had certain experiences you're growing up. And all of those experiences and how you reacted to it is who you are today. So usually if somebody says, who are you? What do? You usually answer by giving a brief biography of yourself, because it's all your experience that sort of says who you are for most people. And so in a certain sense, we identify with who we are based on our life experience and how we've evolved. So what's going to happen in your next life? Well, in your next life, you'll be born to different parents. You'll have maybe the same, maybe different amounts of wealth or suffering, different circumstances, and your life will evolve differently. And your personality and everything will evolve in reaction to those new circumstances. And so in a certain sense, you'll almost be like a different person. So what has moved from one life to the next is a continuity of consciousness. So we talk about, in Buddhism, we talk about a mental consciousness, a stream of consciousness and it's a stream of consciousness that is continuous. So in our lives, one moment of consciousness leads to the next moment of consciousness, which leads to the next moment of consciousness. And the difference is that in Buddhism, when you die, that stream of consciousness is not cut off, but it continues. It actually continues into the Bardo intermediate state, and then it continues into your next rebirth. And so your mind, if you like, or your consciousness continues on. But when you're reborn, you don't remember. I'll get to you in just a second, Mary Jo. But when you're reborn, you don't. Usually, for most people, they don't remember anything of their previous lives, and so your life just evolves according to your new circumstances. Okay, Mary Jo, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yes. So I was just wanting to understand, is that stream of consciousness also then associated or connected with our karma?
Yes, it is, because the karma is connected with the stream of consciousness.
Okay.
So the karma that is done while you have this consciousness actually ripens either later in this life or in future lifetimes with that same stream of consciousness. Yes, exactly correct. Okay, so again, what mainly moves from life to life is actually our karma. Because if you think about it, another way of thinking about it is look at your current life. You know, are you the same person as when you were 3 years old? Were you the same person now as when you were 10 years old, or in your teens, or your early 20s? Or, as we move through life, we change. Our minds change, certainly our bodies change. And so in a certain sense, we think of ourselves as just being one person, as being the static thing, but actually we're constantly changing all throughout our lives. And so in a certain sense, when you go on to your next life, it's just the continuation of that continuous change. So in the same way as our current life, we change with our current life, depending on the experiences, the situations we're in. The same thing will continue as we move to our next life. We'll have different parents, different situations, and we'll continue to change in response to all of those things. So in a certain sense, maybe, you can think about as rebirth is no different than the evolution of our life from childhood even to older age. It's just more continuous change. So just a few brief things that I wanted to mention also is when we talk about karma, what creates karma, one thing that's really important in Buddhism is that karma is primarily intention. So it's the intention that we have that really creates the karma. So for example, before you actually, I don't know if you're going to stab somebody with a knife, in your mind, you create that intention to harm the person. It's that intention of harming that is really the karma. That's when you generate the karma. When you actually go through with the thing and actually maybe stab the person with the knife, so you actually do harm it, that completes the karma. And so it sort of makes it worse if you like. But really, karma is really an intention of the mind. It's an intention of the mind either to harm someone or to try to help somebody. So I think that's a really important notion to keep in mind about what really creates karma. Another thing too is that, just to talk a little bit about, the Buddha actually talked about virtuous and non-virtuous actions. And ironically enough, they ended up to be 10, the same number as the 10 commandments. But I don't know why that came about. But anyway, I think the way to think about it is I think you should think about them as more, they're not really commandments, they're more examples of ways of harming. So the Buddha said that we can harm people with our mind, with our body, and with our speech. And so these various negative non-virtuous actions are non-virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind. And there are 3 bodily non-virtuous actions, which are killing people, or I think more generally, maybe physically beating them up or killing them, physically harming them, stealing from them, taking their stuff, and sexual misconduct, harming people through sexuality. And there's actually 4 of speech, which are lying to people. Divisive speech, that means speech where you try to sort of split up couples, for example, talk to them in a way that cause them to split up or become angry at each other. Hurtful speech, sort of malicious speech where you're trying to say things that you know will hurt other people. The last one is a little bit strange. It's called idle chatter. And I think what it means is basically, if you're just messing around, idly chattering, it often tends to go to gossip, and it often tends to turn into the other harmful speeches. But that's a little bit when it's a little harder to understand. There's 3 non-virtuous actions of mind, which are covetousness, which means in our mind wanting to get things from other people. Malice, actually minds of hatred, or it's actually, malice is really a mind of mentally wishing to harm somebody. Oh, I wish that person would die, or it's a mind where we're wishing to harm people. And again, since I said that karma is generated primarily in the mind by our intention, we have to really actually in Buddhism learn to watch our minds. And the third one is holding wrong views. And what that means is, wrong views is, it means holding views that in a sense, harm us by views that block our spiritual progress. So that's what wrong views are, ways that sort of cause us to, instead of make spiritual progress, maybe go the other direction. So I think in general, in Buddhism, these things aren't really so much commandments as I think they're sort of illustrations of the ways that we can harm people. And of course, the 10 virtuous actions are all the opposites of that. So, instead of, killing somebody, it would be maybe, taking care of somebody that's sick, for example, or something like that. So anyway, you can think about it just being the opposite. The one important thing about Buddhist ethics, again, I can't spend a long time talking about it, but in Buddhism, what's really considered, important is not sort of the formal thing, like don't kill people or something like that. What's really important is that the actual concrete situation that you're in. So Buddha always emphasized that what matters is the real situation. So you have to ask yourself, this action may look like it's a negative action, but maybe it's actually beneficial. So the only way what you can know is whether something is beneficial or harmful is actually looking at the concrete situation. What's really going on? What is the right thing to say? Because sometimes, for example, if you get angry at a person and yell at them, that could also, in the correct circumstances, normally we think of that as negative. But, if you have a young child that's about ready to touch a hot stove and yell at them, stop, and really are really agitated and angry, you may be able to stop them from actually touching that hot stove and burn themselves. And so that's the idea of in Buddhist ethics. Again, it's all intention. It's like you're trying to do the best you can. But, it's not, in Buddhism, there are no rigid rules. What really matters is what's really going on. What is harmful, what is beneficial. So it's not as if, so these 10 non-virtuous actions are sort of, like I say, illustrations. What really matters is, whether you actually are benefiting or actually harming the person. So I think that's important to talk about. Okay. So now let me move on to the truth of cessation, the third noble truth. So this is this noble truth that it is actually possible to purify your mind, to remove the negativities of your mind. And in a certain sense, that's what enlightenment is. It's actually purifying your mind. And so it's really, a lot of this is really working on this pleasure, these delusions, afflictions. Because in a certain sense, a delusion or affliction, you can define it in various ways. But when you talk about it as a delusion, it's actually a distorted way of looking at the world. And so what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that usually these delusions and afflictions have a large sense of sort of ego involved with them. So for example, if you want a lot of money, you can ask yourself, well, why do I want all that money? It's because it's for me, it's to make my life better. And so what happens is we get this attachment, this greed, this lust for something good like money or a new car or something good. And we're so attached to it, it causes us to actually harm other people to achieve this goal, often in many cases. And in fact, Buddha has a wonderful analogy about this notion of attachment or greed. And it's not that pleasurable things are bad. But this analogy is a very, very interesting analogy. The Buddha said, imagine taking this absolutely sharp knife, the sharpest knife you can think of, and putting some honey along the edge of that knife. The Buddha said, imagine trying to lick off that honey without cutting yourself. So the pleasure you get from the honey is not bad. The problem is is can you do it without cutting your tongue? And that's the problem with pleasure and attachment, is we get so attached to it that we're willing to do these negative things to get this pleasure. And so it's very easy for things that we're attached to turn negative in order to accomplish our goal. And again, it often involves a strong sense of ego. You know, it's like we want all the good things for ourselves. And, you know, so we put ourselves first. And in doing that, a lot of times that causes us to steal, take things from other people, to, you know, all sorts of negative things. And so, you know, and actually it was interesting because I was once, when I was first started as a Buddhist, I was at some Buddhist event, and there was these dining halls where you randomly sit next to different people. And there was this one woman who was sitting next to me, and she was saying, "Oh, Buddhism has ruined my life because, you know, I've learned that she thought that you couldn't enjoy anything pleasurable in life." She says, "You know, now if I see a wonderful sunset or something, I don't feel any great pleasure from it because I'm not supposed to get attached to it or whatever." And she felt like her whole Buddhism had ruined her whole life, that it was just, you know, she didn't have these great joys and anything. So it's very important to actually get this fine distinction. It's perfectly fine to enjoy pleasures, to see a beautiful sunset or whatever, or to have a wonderful meal. There's nothing wrong in that. The real problem is this attachment to it. And the Buddha talks about the attachment as also, think about putting some oil on a cloth, and the oil sinks into the cloth, and it's almost like the oil becomes part of the cloth. That's the attachment. So enjoy the beautiful sunset, but you have to do it with the understanding that it's going to change. It's very brief, it's evanescent. All human pleasure is very brief and evanescent. And if you can sort of let go of this attachment to it and just enjoy it. Oh, this is wonderful. This is a beautiful sunset. Okay, the sun is now set, it's gone. Well, that was wonderful. You know, it's that sort of thing. That's the important thing, is to let go of this attachment to it, to let go, not to become attached to it, because it's the attachment that causes all of the suffering and pain. Because, you know, if you think that this sunset is the most wonderful thing in the world and you try to hang on to it, then you're so sad when it's gone, and that, you know, you're suffering. What is it? But if you just enjoy it and then let go, and just with that expectation, yes, everything changes, it's okay. You know, and it's the same way with the opposite side, suffering. Suffering happens. Okay, well, it's not going to stay there all the time. It'll change also. Even suffering won't stay the same. And so it's the same way, because what happens in suffering? We get caught up in our mind. Our mind spins around it over and over again. Oh, my knee hurts. My knee hurts. And we focus all of our attention on our knee, and it makes it hurt even more. You know, and the more you focus all your attention on your pain and your suffering, the more you suffer. And that's why most of our suffering is mental suffering, because we're attached to it. We become attached to even negative things. We become attached to. And again, the message is let go of it. It's okay. You know, just accept that it is what it is, and it will change. And so this notion of attachment is so critically important. And the way that delusion comes in, this distortion, is part of all delusions and afflictions is exaggeration, this notion of exaggeration. So what happens is let's say we have a wonderful meal and we think, wow, this tastes wonderful. I've never had such a wonderful thing before. And then in our mind focuses on it. Our mind starts spinning over and over again. And in our mind, we blow it up, we exaggerate. We think, oh, this is so wonderful. And thinking it's so wonderful, we even think it's even more wonderful because we're exaggerating. And, you know, in reality, maybe it's just slightly better than normal, but in our mind, we're blowing it up into this huge thing. You know, this is typically what happens to young teenagers in love, you know, when you're first love, you know, it's like this other person is the most amazing person whatsoever. You know, they have no faults whatsoever. And that's how delusions work. And that's why they're distortions, because delusions almost always have this notion of exaggeration. For delusions like attachment, where we think something is wonderful or good, we exaggerate all the good qualities and we sort of ignore any negative things. You know, it's like when you fall in love, this other person is so wonderful. We think only about the good things and we ignore all the bad things about them. And then it's the same way with the opposite side. So hatred or pushing things away, or even things that seem disgusting, we blow those up too. We think, oh, this person's my enemy. They are such a horrible human being, you know, and we make them like this hound from hell or something, this fiend or whatever. And we just think about them and exaggerate all of how bad they are and all the different ways that they're bad. And we exaggerate it. And that makes us angrier and angrier. It makes us want to harm them more and more. And it's like the snowball effect. And that's why delusions build up. And again, it's almost always centered around ourselves. Why do we hate that person? Because we think that that person harmed us in some way, or maybe harmed somebody of our family, which is like an extension of ourselves. So there's almost always a notion of ego involved in this delusion. And because of this notion of ego, because we evaluate everything that's happening to us in the world in terms of whether it's good or bad for us, we distort it, we exaggerate it. We exaggerate good qualities, we exaggerate bad qualities. And that's why it's very hard to look at the world in a very impartial way. And in fact, that's a big purpose of meditation in Buddhism, is in Buddhist meditation and Vipassana meditation, you can actually learn how to look at the world in an objective, realistic way, the way the world really is. And in fact, that's the main theme of Buddhism. The main theme of Buddhism is the thing that actually makes it possible to make your life better, is actually to see the world as it really is, without all of these distorting filters of our ego, if you like. Okay, so, and then the other reason, the other notion of afflictions or delusions is they're almost always disturbing to our mind. And they can go either direction. You know, it's like the young teenage girl who is in love for the first time. You know, it's like she's very distraught a lot of the time. Again, it's this clinging or grasping to this other person. And all this anxiety about it is almost always a sign that there's some form of delusion. And on the other hand, it's the same way with our enemies, again, or things that we don't like, our mind. So if your mind is really disturbed or anxious or upset, it's almost always a clear sign of a delusion or affliction being present. So that's the notion of the affliction part of the affliction. And that's why they can translate it either way, because it has these sort of different aspects to it. Okay. So the important part, okay, so yeah, so the other thing about true cessation, so true cessation is that it is possible to dampen down temporarily all of these afflictions. If you work at the spiritual path, for example, if you have a lot of anger over a long period of time through meditation and applying various antidotes and working at it, you can train your mind not to be angry. You can learn to let go of attachment. You can learn to, you know, and that's what most of the Buddhist spiritual path is. It's really a path of training the mind to deal with all of this stuff. And there are specific practices you can do, specific antidotes, which of course, in this short course, I can't get into. For example, one antidote to anger or hatred is love. There's a wonderful practice you can try doing, which I always recommend in all these classes I teach, because I found it because again, it's important to play with this stuff for yourself, to actually see it in practice and see whether it works. And one thing that's a wonderful practice to do is, let's say you go to the grocery store. When you're standing in line at the grocery store, look at the person ahead of you in line and say, I wish, may you be happy. And just really wish that that person be happy. You look at the person in front of them, you say, may you be happy. And in your mind, you develop this wish and you genuinely think, may they be happy. You look at the cashier who's, dealing with all the groceries, and you wish them to be happy. And when you do that, see how it changes your mind. I think it's even more dramatic if you do this as you're driving your car in traffic. So you're driving your car across town and somebody cuts in front of you. Instead of getting angry at them, think, may you be happy. I'm so happy that you're getting ahead of me, that you have an opportunity to get wherever you're going faster than I am. How wonderful for you. I'm happy that you're happy. And you start, just try generating these thoughts and see how it changes your mind. And I can guarantee you that if you start thinking this way, you start becoming happy. It just, when you wish other people to become happy, it makes you happy. It's completely transformative. It's a wonderful practice. There's a Theravadan monk who actually has a whole thing starting every meditation practice with this sort of happiness meditation, where he you start with the people closest to you, and eventually you think of the whole world. May you be happy. And it's a way to make your mind very peaceful and very calm and very happy. And in fact, if you're really angry, it's a wonderful calming practice to make this wishing for other people to be happy. And it's very simple. I mean, you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything. You can be driving the car. You can be lying in bed, and you can just think, may this person be happy. May that person be happy. And so this is, again, one of these practice things. The way Buddhism is supposed to work is, again, the Buddha said, don't believe everything I say, but try it out for yourself and see if it works. And I think that is genuinely the way it works. The only way that people ever get confidence in Buddhism, which is what they call faith, is confidence in Buddhism, is you got to try it out and see if it actually changes your life, if it makes your life better. And that's so important in Buddhism. Buddhism is meant to be a hands-on thing. And so little simple things like this can be so helpful to you, because you can try them out and you can see. And then once you try this out, you can think, oh, well, this is a wonderful little trick. I wonder if Buddha has other little tricks in his basket. So anyway, this is things that I do periodically. And this actually generates enormous positive karma. I mean, it's a wonderful intention to want other people to be happy. And part of the reason why it makes you happy is because it's generating positive karma. And in fact, the real Buddha, the historical Buddha, when he was alive, he talked about generating this loving kindness. Sometimes they translate it as, Theravadins translate it as metta, meaning loving kindness. This loving kindness meditation, especially if you extend it to all living beings. I mean, the Buddha said, extend it to this quarter, to that quarter, all the quarters in all the different directions. Try to as you generate this wish for other people to be happy, especially the more people you generate it to, it generates enormous amounts of positive karma. In fact, it's the easiest way to generate large amounts of karma that you can do. But I would say, just, and it's wonderful to do it individually. Like I say, as you're driving across town, or you're in a store, or even, a member of your family. Maybe there's a member of your family that you don't like that much, and they show up for some dinner, Thanksgiving or something. Think as they walk through the door, may you be happy, and see how it changes your relationship with that person. I mean, it's a really, anyway, it's one of those things that is so simple and yet can be so profound. And it's something that anybody can try. And you just do it, you see what happens. So for your homework for this week, just try it a few times and see what happens. That's what I recommend. Okay, are there any questions at this point? Let's see, Mary Jo, do you have a question? Can you turn your microphone on?
Yes. Is the dedications that we do, to different beings, those who have died or ill or obstacles, is that sort of along that line a way of wishing them happiness? Is it kind of like that?
Yes, in a way. It is believed that it goes beyond that. So when you're doing, I mean, in this class, I don't do any prayers at the beginning or any dedications, because this is supposed to be a class that non-Buddhists can take. So we try not to make non-Buddhists feel uncomfortable. So this is, and most of the time we get mainly Buddhists in this class, but I have had people who are non-Buddhists show up in this class. And so this is a class that is also supposed to be benefit people who are just curious about Buddhism, may never become a Buddhist, but they just want to find out about it. So in this class, we skip a lot of the ritual of, beginning prayers and dedications at the end. Although if you want to do that, that's a good thing. So the notion of dedication generally is sort of a way of sort of trying to direct your karma. And since we are connected to everybody else, our prayers and wishes in the Mahayana tradition are said to be of great benefit. And it's actually believed that through our prayers and dedications, that it does have an influence on other people. And it's a little bit unclear, the mechanism, because of course, the Buddha also said we're responsible for each of our spiritual lives. So, and the reason for that is that our spiritual life is really about us transforming our life. The Buddha said, I can't wave my hand and take you to Nirvana, because the reason you're stuck in samsara is because of your own mind. It's the negativities in your own mind that are causing you to remain stuck in samsara. So you have to change those. I can't change it. But what the Buddhists can do, and what we can do, and I think the mechanism that I've always heard about this is we talk about blessings. So what do blessings do? In my mind, the thing that's made most sense is we can affect the ripening of karma for other people. So what that means is that through our prayers and our connection with other people, when we do positive things through our connection, that connection can help ripen positive karma that other person has already created. And through that ripening of that karma, that other person can receive benefit. And that other person can also, perhaps the ripening of that karma may also help transform that person, help that person in their spiritual path as well, which would be a double blessing. And so that has basically been, in my mind, what I think is the mechanism, or what I've heard from other people. And it's the same way in our life. I mean, that's why what we're doing at this moment is so important, because, karma ripens, but the Buddha said it doesn't ripen one for one. It's not a tit for tat. So how karma ripens depends upon the person we are right now. So in the same way, because we have these connections with other people, or we have connections with the various Buddhas through various prayers and so forth, the prayers and so forth to the various Buddhas, these religious ceremonies are ways of connecting, spiritually connecting to the Buddhas or enlightened beings. And it's through that connection that we can receive their blessings, that we can allow them to help transform us. Okay. And so that's the way it's believed. So prayers, I know one powerful Buddha who said, that's what Buddhists do, we pray. because it's, these connections help us. We're all dependent on other people. It's like we're not alone in the world. We're so interconnected. And that's why also, that's the other important thing of our own spiritual path, because it sounds very egotistical. Oh, I'm focused on my own spiritual path. I'm making my life better moment by moment. Well, what about all our relatives, our friends, our children, our parents, all these other people? Well, actually, the positive thing about our spiritual life is because we are connected to all of these other people. Every time we make our own lives better, we influence these people. It's positive for them also. It's so important to understand this. It's not selfish. The best thing you can do is to progress yourself along the spiritual path, because that is the way that you can best help all of your loved ones. And it's also how you can make the world a better place. You know, it's like each, and it's the one thing we can do. We don't have, for most of us, you know, we aren't great spiritual, powerful beings. We're just, you know, ordinary people. But at least, you know, every time, every little bit we do to make our lives better, we're transforming the world. And everything is cumulative. You know, there's many examples in Buddhism where they talk about filling up buckets of water drip by drip. You know, or you look at the Grand Canyon, how it's been worn away drip by drip as this river flows through it. And that is an important, and it's true, it makes a difference.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
so it's really important to think of that way. So that's the best answer I can think. You know, some of these
Thank you.
things are,
Yeah, that's very
are
good.
very difficult to understand, and I don't know if I understand them correctly. I keep
Well,
trying to learn better and better, but
thank you. That's helpful to me. Thank you.
okay. So, okay, so I'm almost done. So,
Bob,
okay. Yes,
could I ask just a quick question?
sure, absolutely.
Just said, talking about prayer, and for me, my way background, no more, is a Catholic background, and so prayer was to people who had lived in a real lifetime, the saints or
Yes.
Mary or Jesus. They were real people that had died and moved on. So that part, I don't have a problem with that. But in Buddhism, a lot of the prayers are made to, or invocations are made to deities that are an aspect. My understanding is they're some aspect of Buddha, the
Yes.
medicine Buddha or Avalokiteshvara, etc. But they weren't a real person.
Well, no, actually that's wrong. It's believed that they were a real person. So Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, Tara, all of these people, all of these Buddhas that are prayed to in the Mahayana tradition, are believed to have one time been ordinary people like us. And you are correct, though, that they do manifest certain aspects of the Buddha. Because once you become a Buddha is a perfect being. So in that sense, every single Buddha is identical. Because if you're a perfect being, how could one perfect being be better or worse than another perfect being? Or how could a perfect being even differ from another perfect being? So Buddhas are all perfect beings. So you say, oh, yeah, they're all the same, but then why do we pray to Manjushri for wisdom, to Avalokiteshvara for compassion, and so forth? So why do we do that? And the answer that is traditionally given is that before these people became Buddhas, while they were on their spiritual path, they themselves actually saw something as important. And they themselves made vows to help people in the future any way they can, connected with that. So for Manjushri, he made vows to help people by helping them with their wisdom. Because if you have wisdom, you can achieve, that's how we achieve in life, through wisdom. For, Avalokiteshvara, concern for compassion and so forth. So it's said that each of these different Buddhas, by connecting to them, it helps us to improve a certain quality in our personal life, like compassion or wisdom, through that connections. But it's done through their previous karma, through the karma they created before they became a Buddha. But having created that previous karma, once they became a Buddha, because they had had these previous vows, it made it possible for us as humans to connect to them, to particularly participate in this special quality. So it's not that, so I think that's more the idea. So so actually all Buddhas are identical, but for us, we can benefit in our own personal lives better in certain ways. And for some of us, some people connect to different Buddhas better than others. And through the connections they make, again, it makes it easier to obtain the blessings of that Buddha through these connections. And that's the real purpose of these various pujas or spiritual things, is to make this connection with those Buddhas, to gain familiarity with them, to make connections so that we can gain their blessings. And it's considered very important in Buddhism to make requests to the Buddhas. Okay. And in a certain sense, if you think about it logically, if you're requesting a Buddha to give you wisdom or compassion or love or any other good quality, in your mind, you're setting up that intention to move in that direction. So already, it's like you're doing something very positive. You're creating this positive, virtuous connection. You're setting this direction of your mind. So it's already benefiting you. So in a certain sense, yeah, so it's all, so it all connects with our own intention also. So it's a beautiful thing to wish to become compassionate or wise or something like that. And so making these requests, it's like we're actually already moving our life in that direction. So I don't know, it's a little, these things are difficult to understand. They're certainly, very deep and probably well beyond my understanding. But that's sort of the best I can say about them. I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Because with the purification practice with Vajrasattva, for example,
yes,
I can't sort of figure out how to connect to an aspect of something rather than what seemed to me would be a real live person who once lived and made an effort.
Yeah. Well, Vajrasattva once lived also, and his virtuous intention was the wish to help purify people of their negative karma. And so that's why he's beneficial in helping us to accomplish that goal. And there are actually 4 different things, 4 different ways that you should be thinking about when you do the purification. There's 4 components. So, and it's important to do that because the other aspect of purification is this really a way of transferring our minds. So one of them, for example, is regret for what we did. Another is the wish to never do it again. Another is relying on spiritual practice for help and things like that.
Yeah.
So there are these other things that are involved, which one should be involving ourselves when we do the practice. But it's basically, and as you keep doing this, you can see that you are transforming your mind, and you can see why it's purifying it. That if you actually in our mind do these 4 component practices, you are sort of making it harder to do these negative things ever again. So, okay. Let's see. I think I'm running out of time. It's 9:01. The only other thing I wanted to say is that again, I'm going to talk about. There's actually different types of enlightenment, and I'm going to talk about that probably, I think, next week maybe. So there's again, just for the terminology that's helpful. We have 2 different levels of Buddhist practice. I talked about Hinayana, or foundational practice, or Theravada practice, and I talked about Mahayana, which the Mahayana is, in a certain sense, an extension of the earlier stuff. It's actually sort of just pushing it to a higher level, if you like. But in the original version that the Buddha talked, he talked about liberation from samsara. And he talked about that as being nirvana or enlightenment. When we move to the Mahayana path, we will be talking about, in the Mahayana path, they actually talk about a higher form of enlightenment, which is the enlightenment of becoming a full Buddha. So it goes beyond just liberating ourselves from samsara. It actually involves higher purities of mind. And even in the Theravadan and even in the original form of historical Buddhism, people noticed that there was a big difference between what were called arhats in Sanskrit or arahants in Pali, which is the language that the Theravadins use for their scriptures, a variant form of Sanskrit. But anyway, these people, so you're an arhat or an arhat if you achieve liberation from samsara. In the Mahayana tradition, that's considered a small enlightenment. And A full enlightenment is when you become like Buddha himself, completely perfect. And like I say, even at the time of Buddha, many people became arhats or arahants at the time of Buddha, but they were not at the same level as Buddha. And so anyway, in the Mahayana tradition, they explain how you move from the arhat to arahant all the way to full Buddhahood. And so that has to do with bodhicitta and things that I'll talk about probably beginning next week. But anyway, in the Mahayana tradition, it's said that ultimately every single sentient being will eventually achieve full enlightenment. The only problem is it may take many eons or longer. So we want to do it faster. So the goal is to do it faster. But in the Mahayana tradition, it's said that everybody will ultimately reach that level. And it's said that all the people who become Buddhas are working to help all the rest of us who are here now to achieve that. And I will talk more about how to think about that next week. Again, I don't want to run over because some of you are staying up late if you're on the East Coast already, and I don't want to keep you up. So I like to end on time. So next week, I'm actually going to begin plunging through the actual path, step by step, from the very beginning stages all the way to full enlightenment, which, by the way, you often practice in parallel mode. Often people are doing advanced practices at the same time they're doing simple practices. So you shouldn't think about it as truly step by step. There's a lot of parallelism. So, but anyway, let me just ask if there's any final questions for tonight, so I don't go over. Okay. So I've given you a lot. I hope it's helpful to you. And so next week we will plunge ahead. And if you have any questions during the week, please save them up and I'll try to answer them at the beginning of the next session. So thank you all for joining tonight. I hope it was beneficial to you.